Hi folks, I'm Jack Kennedy and welcome to Farm Tech Talk, the markets show. I'm delighted to be joined by Katrina Morrissey, our news editor, and Phelim O'Neill, our market specialist. Good guys, thanks for coming on. Look, lots happening again this week, I suppose, in COVID-19 restricted Ireland. Phelim, if I jump to you first, one of the big issues I see that you have in the journal this week is, I suppose, the impact of COVID-19 on the overall EU economy, and I suppose specifically the agricultural budget. I mean, farmers just today, Friday, are submitting their BPS application form, but I mean, there's a chance, I suppose, or there's a real possibility now that the CAP budget is under pressure. Give us a flavour for us, I suppose, some of that story around that piece in terms of the shrinkage of the EU agricultural budget.
That's right, Jack, and it all comes from the basis on which the EU is funded. Basically, the European Union budget determined by a contribution made by member states, and it's always in or around 1% of a country's national income. So 1% is given to the European Union by all of the member states. That makes up the budget that they have. And in the budget that was being prepared this year, that was almost concluded in February, but not quite, the thinking was, or the target was, that there would be a budget for the Common Agriculture Policy to fund it for the next 7 years of about €329 billion or thereabouts. Now, farmers were up in arms about that for very good reason, because if you translate that to an Irish farmer's situation, it meant that the money available, and we had 123,000 applicants last year for a CAP payment, and when you divide that over the 123,000, it meant that compared to the budget that had been in place between 2014 and 2020, Irish farmers were going to take a €2,000 hit on that. That was bad. We have looked now, the impact of coronavirus has meant that the European economies are predicted by the World Trade Organization to shrink by over 7% this year in 2020. Now, if you have shrinking EU economies, that means that countries, member states, have less money available to spend, and to make their percentage contribution to the EU budget will simply leave less money there. And when you translate that reduction of 7.1%, as the WTO forecast, into what it would mean for an Irish farmer's CAP payment, it means that that 2,000 hit that he was being lined up to take in February has been increased by another €876 to make it now €2,876 of a hit, based purely on the reduction in the size of European countries' economies.
But Phelim, is it as simple as that? Like, and obviously this is a moving piece, you know, because the shrinkage is only happening now. But I mean, is there no, I call it, just for want of a better word, I call it a slush fund within the EU that could kind of compensate? Because I mean, after all, I mean, these farmers are farming away right across Europe, and for just a kind of a situation where now is developing that they kind of get cut. I mean, is it as simple as that, or I suppose what's the next steps? I mean, in reality, like, will this happen, and when?
Well, look, the reality, Jack, is that the budget that was being lined up in February before coronavirus was really on the agenda was lining up a huge cut for the payments into CAP and consequently to farmers across the European Union. You're right, it's very much a fluid and moving situation, and member states would have to increase their budget contribution percentage by a significant amount to compensate for that loss. Now, we are all aware, of course, that we've had a huge focus on the supply of medical equipment. Support for agriculture has been down the EU priority list so far in this crisis, and I don't know that we can be optimistic in predicting that it will all of a sudden shoot up the priority list in terms of priorities for a European Union that is very much stretched on money at this time, and looks like it's going to be even more so later this year. And that's why I would have raised in this week's Farmers Journal, based on the basic simple mathematics of what the reduction in size of European economies means going into the wider EU budget from which the Common Agriculture Policy is funded. The indications are very negative from how I see it.
Okay, I hear you. As you say, agriculture is a part of the cake, and because of the challenges, I suppose the EU in general is under us. Especially from a human health perspective, it's unlikely that you'll see a kind of a huge turnaround back to agriculture. Katrina, I see again that you have some kind of, I suppose, you have some feedback from European representatives. You have some commentary on that. Maybe give us a feel for, I suppose, your commentary was specifically around related to the kind of the environmental side of things in terms of the EU Green Deal, and kind of what's coming down the line there for kind of European farmers, including Irish farmers. Just give us a flavour of some of the commentary that you have in the journal this week.
Yeah, so if you'll remember last week we had the European Commission's Biodiversity Report, which was recommending a cut of between 20% and 50% in the case of fertiliser and pesticides. And they also want 25% of all agricultural land in Europe to go into organic. Now that provoked a bit of a reaction, and some of those that we have in this week's paper would be the Copa Cogeca president, Pekka Pesonen, and he is the person who leads that European umbrella body for national farm organisations, of which the IFA would be the Irish representative. And what he said is that it's all well and good, I suppose, aiming for an organic target, but there wasn't any account taken of what going organic would mean for yields and for food production. And he pointed out that in the case of, for example, wheat, that switching to organic and not having the use of the pesticides and fertilizers could cut the yield by up to 60%. And his argument was that the Biodiversity Report put out those ambitions but didn't really delve into the impact of it fully. And another who reacted, I suppose, to it was MEP Mairead McGuinness, and she has made the point, and it's one she's made on a number of occasions, is that farmers should not be incentivised, as they currently are in the BPS, to remove scrubland, which the EU values as a habitat, but farmers currently, if they have scrubland on their farms, would be removing it in order to make it eligible land for payment. So next Wednesday, we're going to see the launch of this farm to fork strategy, which we've been talking about for quite a while at this stage. And that is the farming branch, I suppose, of the Green Deal that the European Commission is talking about. We know that they have ambitious pesticide targets. They want to increase the level of organic. They also have ambitions on labelling of foods. And I think that for us as an exporting nation, we'll be watching very closely, because exporting, we know that Irish beef and dairy is of top quality, but we have so many external markets. What way will they be treated in labelling, I think, will be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. I mean, in terms of the Green Deal, or that story that you had last week in terms of the pesticides and the kind of the organic nitrogen, or the bag nitrogen, I suppose, the artificial nitrogen reduction. I mean, it will have huge implications in terms of Irish agriculture yields and in terms of stocking rates, etc., and that kind of thing. But and we have kind of two worlds emerging, where we have the African countries crying out for food and crying out for meat protein or dairy protein, and yet we have a kind of a cap coming on European production. Phelim, to come back to you, there's a kind of a cap of another sort at the moment, I suppose, in real life here in terms of COVID-19 and some of the issues that are happening, both, I suppose, in Irish factories and in US factories, particularly in kind of the meat factories, and the implications that COVID-19 is having on some of the factories, both home and abroad.
Very much so, Jack. In its caused chaos in the US meat processing industry, and beef and pig meat in particular. Looking at last week's US figures, production or cattle slaughtered processed was down to about 460,000 from what you'd expect, around 650,000 this time of year. That's a third of a drop. Alongside that, cattle prices are falling as well, that are being paid to farmers. And the reason for that is that there simply isn't the processing capacity there. There's thousands of US meat factory workers that are laid up either with COVID-19, and production capacity has been lost. The other side of that coin, and we have a fascinating graph in this week's Farmers Journal in our graph section, where it shows the price of boxed beef, that's processed beef that is in stock, is going through the roof. Actually, the spot market there has gone crazy, and values are double what they were this time last year. Coming closer to home, Jack, on the question of COVID-19 and the factories, definitely inside the border as well, although thankfully not to the extent that it is in the US. I think it's about 12 factories in the Republic of Ireland, south of the border, that are identified as having clusters of it. And also been an issue in Northern Ireland as well, with 2 factories in particular identified on the red meat side, Linden Foods at Dungannon and the foil factory in Ornua. In addition to that, then, Northern Ireland would have one of Europe's biggest poultry processing plants, the Moy Park facility, which has factories in Dungannon and Portadown, Craigavon. And this week, there was a death reported. A member of staff there sadly has lost their life because of coronavirus. And that has brought it very much into the local media attention up here, the issue of the problem in the factories. We're also hearing every day further reports of issues and incidents around testing. Unions are definitely exercised by this. And rightly so, because it is an environment where workers are operating very close together. It's a low temperature environment. It's not as automated as dairy processing, for example. So inevitably the risk is higher, and they are meat factory workers very much a frontline service, given that it is identified as one of the key services in the sector. And it is something that has to be of concern. Certainly, if it was in the autumn, it would be a much bigger issue. The number of cattle that are going through factories at the minute, south of the border, cattle are thereabouts a week. That's well down what it would normally be this time of year. Probably you'd be expecting over 30,000, but in peak season, you're looking at over 40,000. And if we had this experience in the month of October, then we would be facing a real serious issue in the industry.
Yeah, thanks, Phelim. I mean, on that whole market situation, I said, given the kind of, I suppose, the glimmer of hope that's emerging now on beef markets, I put a call into Padraig Brennan, Meat, Food and Beverage Director with Bord Bia, just to get his thoughts, get his flavour in terms of where markets were going. We some very positive signals in terms of, like what you talked about, Phelim, in terms of, kill being at a very low rate, and I suppose a little bit of enthusiasm coming back into markets because the food service thing opening up again. So, listen to what Padraig had to say. And Katrina, I'll come back to you then on one of the other stories that you have in the journal on the live exports.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, well, definitely we've seen a very welcome recovery over the last couple of weeks. And I suppose really a couple of factors driving that. Number one, I suppose we're looking at a tighter supply situation both here and across some of more of the main European markets. We're seeing more promotion on the steak cut side around some of the key markets as well. And I suppose as well as that, what you're starting to see is the first moves towards easing some of the lockdown restrictions across Europe as well. So like if you look at the supply situation here, currently week on week, we're looking at the kill being back anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 head on the same time last year. Obviously, that's tightening up availability. We're certainly seeing more retailers across Europe promoting steak cuts and beef generally over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is certainly a help. The figures are seen coming through in terms of retail sales of beef for the UK. The latest data we have up to late April would show retail sales of beef, they're up by about 15%. Now, mince driving that more than steak, but still welcome. But I suppose they're positives. Now, the retail sales obviously doesn't compensate for the loss of the catering and the hospitality outlets that we'd normally be selling a lot of product into. I suppose they are the outlets when you look at even figures from the European Commission showing that up to 70% of the steak cuts go through catering and hospitality right across Europe. And from an Irish point of view, we would say that between food service and manufacturing, if you like, burgers that would go into food service, upwards of 55% of our beef would end up in those channels. But I think you're looking at a better matched probably supply and demand situation across Europe generally, because you have a number of processors on the continent as well working at reduced capacity, and that's just settling down the market a little bit. What we've seen obviously in terms of cattle prices then, your steer and your heifer prices probably increased by between 10 and 15 cent a kilogram over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is a welcome development. And I suppose when you look at the next couple of weeks coming forward, certainly from our own point of view, I think you're into a situation of tight finished cattle supplies over the next number of weeks as cattle are out to grass now. And I suppose it'll take a little bit of a period before the first of the grass cattle will really start appearing. So slightly more stable, albeit I suppose with tentative signs in terms of what scale of recovery we're likely to see coming through in the food service. And obviously given the importance of that sector from a steak cut point of view, how that develops over the next month or two is going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely some bright lights, or some shining lights, or some green shoots, or some increased prices beginning to emerge in terms of the beef side of things. Katrina, come to you just in terms of a related story, I suppose, is the live export side of things. And I see you have a lovely picture of the Sarah M. Unfortunately, it's anchored off the coast of Waterford. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, that's right, Jack. And beside one of those bright lights that you're talking about, it's actually anchored just off the coast of, or off Hook Lighthouse. So this is a story that has been evolving over the last 2 to 3 weeks. We had the first boat of live cattle go to Algeria, and there was some delay in payment to the farmers, which we documented. All of those farmers were paid for their bulls and bullocks that went successfully to Algeria, and the boat returned. The boat was supposed to be loaded with more bulls and bullocks last Saturday. It didn't happen, and in recent days, I suppose we found out why. And there is a question over the worming of the cattle and the loading of them then onto the boat. So, as you know, the medications all have a withdrawal period, and the cattle are certified to be ready for slaughter when they land on the other side in Algeria. And there's a real discrepancy there in terms of the number of days that the cattle, before the cattle travel, that they should get the wormer. So this is where the Department of Agriculture officials and the exporters have been debating in recent days. And the boat, meanwhile, has been moored, anchored, as you say, in the sea, waiting to see whether it's going to have a cargo or not. Farmers do have cattle to sell, and the type of cattle that this boat is taking, I suppose, is an advantage to them, because they're typically heavy bulls, which they would be penalised quite a lot on price in the factories. So the IFA has wrote in and said that they want the minister to personally intervene and get this boat filled with cattle. And I suppose farmers always see live exports as a good incentive for factories here to pay them the best price possible for their cattle. So an unusual story to be reporting this week, and we await the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating because the demand is huge, as we know, from Africa, from Algeria, and Egypt, and these, African countries in general. So again, on that kind of line, I said it to Padraig, Padraig Brennan from Bord Bia. I told him, I asked him about live exports, and I suppose where we were in 2020 versus 2019, and I suppose what he foresaw was going to happen in the next couple of months. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Well, obviously, you don't want to get into the individual details of a specific case, which has become very public, unfortunately, over the last couple of days. But obviously, in terms of any shipment, there's animal health and welfare criteria that have to be met, and there are European requirements that are there in place. So, for whatever reason, there's been a few issues on this particular case. But I think you hit the nail on the head, Jack, there when you said, in terms of the potential of these markets, obviously, at the moment, to focus on the Algerian market. And I know that Minister Creed, ourselves, and the Department of Agriculture have had a number of delegations in from Algeria over the last year. As recently as February, we had a trade mission to the market as well, with a number of the members of the Livestock Exporters Association. And there's certainly an appetite there in Algeria for Irish cattle, particularly beef cross bulls. And I think there's certainly potential to grow the number of animals that are going to North Africa and Algeria in particular over the next number of months. And you'd be hopeful that whatever issues are there at the moment can obviously be resolved satisfactorily to hopefully help more animals head for that market over the next number of months. Because if you look at traditionally, Algeria is used to buying a lot of cattle from Europe, particularly from France. And I think Irish cattle obviously can match those and can match them in terms of quality and obviously price as well. So I think there's certainly potential to grow the numbers there. And I think when you look at maybe the fall away in live calf exports, outlets like Algeria, like Turkey, like Libya are going to be increasingly important for us over the coming months.
Yeah, you're dead right. I mean, I was actually there in February, in Algeria and in Egypt, and you almost have to stand in it to realise the potential. They have no suckler herd, they have no dairy herd as we know it, so they have no way of generating these animals. So they have to move on the importing side of things. Now, having said all that, Padraig, we're looking at the live export numbers for 2020, kind of, I suppose, to date. How do they compare to 2019? And I suppose what's the kind of reasons for the differences?
Yeah, well, we've seen a decline year to date. We've about a 20% decline in terms of overall live cattle exports up to, we'd say, early May. And the real reason for that is we've seen a fall away in a level of calf exports that are going out. The number of calves exported are down by more than a quarter. So we've exported nearly 40,000 fewer calves, if you like, to date this year compared to the same time last year. Two factors at play there, really, Jack. Number one, during the month of February, weather wasn't good. There was a lot of sailings that got badly disrupted and cancelled. I think we lost something like 7 out of 15 sailings at one particular point in February. So that led to a slower start in terms of calf exports this year. The second factor then, if you look at our main market for our calf exports, is obviously the Dutch market into the Dutch field sector. And again, no more than ourselves in relation to beef, the Dutch field sector is highly dependent on the restaurant trade across Europe in terms of an outlet for its products. So you've seen a contraction, I should say, in terms of the Dutch field sector over the last couple of months, and that's affecting the demand for calves. But the positive note in terms of live exports is if you take calves out of the equation, every other category has shown an increase in live exports to date this year. And I think if you were to look ahead down the track for the next number of months and into the autumn, there's certainly signs there to be reasonably optimistic in terms of live cattle exports. I think there's certainly what appears to be a market there for reared calves in the likes of Spain and Italy. Certainly there's potential for more animals to go to international markets as well. So I think they'll be important as we go through the next number of months and on into 2021, if we are left with more calves on the ground here as we are relative to this time last year.
So, Phelim, that was Padraig Brennan, I suppose, and his thoughts on live exports. Closer to home, meat factories, meat markets, beef prices, they're all beginning to kind of take a touch upwards. And I see you have a front page story there in terms of actual beef prices rising, which we haven't had for a long time. So it is a positive light. Give us a flavour, Phelim, for what's happening out there in meat markets.
That's right, Jack. Adam led this week with another week of rising prices in beef factories, bringing the base price for steers and heifers up to $3.55 and $3.60 a kilo, which is the third week in a row of rising prices. A long way maybe we might expect it to be this time of year, but given where we were a month ago, it's certainly a much brighter picture. This is basically the retail trade, the supermarket trade has been very good and very strong with increased demand. We've been hurt by the loss of the food service and the hospitality markets, particularly on the steak meat side. But there has been a move on promoting steak meat in many European countries, a very heavy promotion in the UK by the supermarkets there. And that's taken some of that out of the marketplace. And on top now we have the news that McDonald's and the other burger chain Supermac are making preparations to get back into production and into business again. And that's a driver for sales of cow beef. And there we've seen prices this week going up as high as €3 a kilo. So all in all, while prices are not where we would expect them to be this time of year, they're certainly a lot better than they were a month ago. And it's also been good news for sheep farmers as well. With the new season lamb prices this week touching on $6.20, $6.30 a kilo. Again, if full access to European markets might have meant that they would be higher than that, but at this time, that's a reasonable price.
Yeah, it is, and it's early yet, as you say. In this, there's no big glut of lambs coming out, so it's good that they're in that position, and that's a good bit ahead of 2019, as you say already, even in this early lamb season. Katrina, I'm afraid it's not so good as news on the pedigree showing cattle front. I mean, all the shows we touched off it last week, the ploughing has been cancelled, and all the livestock shows in the main have been cancelled. Like, I mean, it is a real downer for those that are big into livestock shows and kind of that whole industry that goes around it.
Yeah, and it is a whole industry. I suppose breeders, pedigree breeders in particular, treat the shows like a shop window for their herd at home. You know, they'll bring their best animals to the show and hope to sell many more on the back of it. So yeah, this week, I suppose in the paper, we spoke to several show circuit stalwarts, I suppose you'd call it. We have one man who's been showing since he was 14 and he's been doing it for 40 plus years. We saw, I suppose, how many local shows were cancelled, and now we've seen the real cream of the crop taken out as well. This was supposed to be the week of Balmoral Show, huge event for the north of Ireland. The ploughing was officially cancelled, as we mentioned last week, and that's a loss of about 35 million to the economy. So a huge effect there. And, you know, those animals, they move out of their age categories. Heifers will go in calf. They won't be necessarily suitable for showing next year. There's a real knock-on effect to all of these cancellations. And it's, I suppose, it's in the next 12 months that we'll see how much was lost this year because of the coronavirus.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a real downer for those that are in that space. And, you know, I mean, it's a great place for young people to get involved as well in terms of showing animals. Right, folks, I'm going to leave it at that in terms of the meat side of things. And I want to touch, and I'm going to leave you off the hook on this one because I put a call in already to Colin Kelly, head of strategy at Ornua. I want to touch on the dairy side of things and dairy markets and where they are, because obviously we're seeing kind of, I suppose, dairy markets increasing in terms of a European and a kind of and at a global level. We see the GDT auction, I suppose, steadying. We've seen European prices for commodity products actually rise. But here at home, I suppose we've seen, you know, Lakeland and Bia cut milk price again for April by another cent a litre. So I suppose there's just that little bit of a lag time in terms of that real dip that happened, and now it's just coming onto Irish farmers. But I said I put a call into Colin Kelly. He's head of our strategy with Ornua, as I said. Ornua, of course, market the majority of our product out of Ireland. So I just asked him about kind of where his thoughts were on markets at the moment and what he could see happening in the next couple of weeks. Let's hear what he had to say.
I suppose when we talked a couple of weeks ago, we had milk figures into the end of February, and we were talking about global supply being up 1.2%, including the March numbers. That number now is 1.4%. So certainly milk has been very strong, driven largely by the US and Europe. New Zealand remains behind, but if you look at the US, they're up 1.8%. Year to date in Europe is up 1%. A couple of big drivers within Europe being France, Germany, ourselves here in Ireland, Poland, Netherlands, generally strong across the board in Europe with the exception of the UK, which is actually down 2.2%. And they've obviously had their weather challenges and also some issues around dumping of milk over the past number of weeks. So a little bit of milk going unprocessed. There, talk of up to 2% per week throughout part of April. So when we look at, I suppose, where is milk going to go? Their weather has been quite good in Europe, and as we know ourselves, in Ireland it's been quite dry. We're seeing similar in New Zealand, and issues with feed in New Zealand and also in Europe. We see palm kernel up 78% since the start of the year in New Zealand, so that's leading to a lot of cows being dried off early there. From a European perspective, that's manifesting in particular in France and Germany, issues with feed in terms of plants running in Germany, and then France, very dry weather, and we're seeing that come through in their week 17 and week 18 milk figures down 0.3% and 0.8% respectively.
Okay, so I suppose we've different scenarios. We've New Zealand where there a lot of drying off going on. That milk supply is going to come right off. And on the European side, we're seeing some areas getting very dry, and again, which will cut supply. And I suppose even on the US side of things, we talked to some US farmers on this show that are going to cut supply for the first time in a long time. Now it probably was going to be March, April before they were cutting because of the situation with the COVID-19. So, but as you say, overall, you know, up to the end of March, 1.4% up. So that's the supply side. The demand side, Colin, is the demand still there, or where is this kind of, I suppose, level off or steadiness coming from dairy markets?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple of pieces, Jack. Ultimately, the fresh market is what's driving the prices at the moment. If we look maybe at the US to start off with, since we would have spoken a couple of weeks ago, the US prices actually on cheese are up 33% and butter is up 28%. So a couple of things have happened there. We were speaking about the USDA in conjunction with the Dairy Food Association looking to essentially curb supply and give incentives to do that, and the farm protection programs have kicked in. But the other big thing that's happening is the government is spending over $1 million between here and the end of September on purchasing dairy products, which is equating to about 2.5% of monthly milk in the US. So that has certainly led to a shoot up in pricing in the US, but it's largely driven by the fact that supply is correcting and the government are supporting the market through their purchases. If we look at demand across Europe and I guess Asia, in particular. Similar story in that we're seeing retail still in that region to 20-25% up. Food service remains down, but there are some green shoots coming on the food service side as we see restrictions starting to be lifted. So people who we maybe would have seen running at 20% of buying capacity on the food service side now getting back up towards 40 and 50%. And what we're seeing happening at the moment is that they are filling their supply chain and I guess getting ready in anticipation for restrictions being lifted and a level of normality coming back into things. The prices since we spoke over the last 2 weeks, we have seen the butter and skim pick up on the Dutch. They're both actually up €80 a tonne in the last 2 months. Butter, we would say the weather from a French perspective is probably having an impact there and causing a little bit of nervousness around cream and cream availability. And we've seen cream return to being a multiple of butter rather than being a discount as it had been in March and April. The other big thing, I guess, that's happened, which is helping both of those, is PSA. So government intervention has happened in the US, and I guess we're getting government support from a European perspective. So that's seen 90,000 tonnes of skim being supported, 100,000 tonnes of cheese, and 140,000 tonnes of butter. So I guess what we would say is we've gotten a little bit of a lift in pricing. The question now is, can it be sustained? And you referenced milk prices at the start. Obviously, one will have a link to the other, but maybe not necessarily an immediate link. And I'm sure milk prices over the next number of months may be impacted by reduced sales over the last number of months, or sales at prices lower than where we're at today.
Okay, so I hear you. There's a little bit of a lag phase, as you say, between the kind of direct market piece and I suppose what farmers are getting. But but overall, okay, at the moment, as you say, and I suppose it's a watch this space one. We're seeing a kind of a slight taper off in terms of supply, and maybe a kind of an increasing demand, driven maybe in part by the PSA thing and the storage piece that's happening there. Colin, to finish up on this, if you were to kind of watch one or two things over the next kind of month or 2 months, what would be key for you in terms of watching? Because obviously, you know, New Zealand effectively, I'll call it, is supply wise is out of the market at this stage. But in terms of supply or demand, I suppose, what would you watch that's critical over the next kind of month or 2 months?
Yeah, I guess, Jack, the ideal thing to happen would be a supply correction. We see in the US we're getting that supply correction, and there's talk of milk maybe in May being back as much as 2% there, and expecting that April will be only up maybe 0.5 to 1%. The ideal from a global perspective is that we actually see supply correction. When we see the macroeconomic pieces coming out in the World Trade Organization saying that trade will be down 13 to 32% this year, and you see the IMF coming out saying that the GDP will be down 3%, the economy is going to be under pressure and buying power is going to be reduced. So you would have to imagine that demand, while there might be little peaks as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, it's unlikely to be sustained at the level that it has been, and we still come back to dairy demand being down 10 to 15% this year. So the ideal for us is a supply correction. So reading those stories of warm weather in Europe are certainly a positive for us, and we'd like to see a milk contraction across Europe and across the world generally.
Okay, good to hear from Colin, and I suppose that steadying that's happening in European dairy markets. I mean, one thing that will impact on a milk supply, of course, is the weather. At the moment, it's beautifully sunny here in Ireland. Katrina, while we might all look out at the weather and admire it and say it's great to be looking out at it and it's keeping us all going in these COVID-19 times, I mean, there are some farms that are beginning to be restricted already in terms of drought, lack of moisture.
There are, yeah. Met-Éireann figures show that the soil moisture deficit in the middle of this week was up around 59 millimetres in the driest parts of the country, and that's centred around Dublin and the Pale region, I suppose. There is very much a variation across the country, and this dry weather is absolutely fantastic for areas that would be typically very wet because they're getting massive grass growth. But those areas where the soil moisture deficit is very high, it's restricting growth growth, and it's costing farmers money as well. We have a front page picture in this week's paper of a horticulture grower in the Dublin area, and they're having to irrigate their cauliflowers, and it's costing the farmer, as estimated, 2 cents per pass, and he's going to have to irrigate that particular crop 5 times. So it's adding 10 cents to the cost of the cauliflower for him, which is, it's a big increase in his cost and will be reflected in a cut in his margins, unfortunately. Sticking with the good news, we had a PhD researcher from UCC speak to us this week, and he has some worrying news, I think, that based on the drought of 2018 and this current dry spell that we have, he suspects that Ireland may be hitting into one of what he calls a drought-rich period. And he's studying the incidence of drought and the incidence of fodder crises in Ireland. And he's found that since about the 1850s, there's been 7 of these drought-rich periods. The most recent being in the late 60s, I think 1969 to 72, where there's just a cluster of droughts. We were hearing a lot about clusters at the minute, but this is in relation to dry weather and its impact on fodder production. So there's plenty of that in the paper, and the next 7 to 10 days is forecast dry. So those people who are crying out for rain may have to wait another couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, you're dead right. I mean, the upside of it is, of course, that, there's a lot of guys with silage down and they're getting lovely quality silage, albeit maybe the yield isn't where it is, but it is top quality. And should we get the rains again, that all picks up. Katrina, the other piece, I suppose, and again, it's very difficult to talk about it, but I mean, there have been tragedies at farm level in terms of fatalities, and look, we don't want to go into any specific situation, but I mean, it is an awful pity, and I suppose we've highlighted this over the last number of weeks. I mean, there's greater risk because there's more people at home. In terms of you touched off it a couple of times in the journal again this week. Give us a flavour.
Yeah, unfortunately, Jack, it falls to us this week to report on some farm fatalities, which is the worst possible outcome for accidents on farms. And this week they included a number of children. And I suppose that's where we are. It is this time of year, a lot of heavy machinery working on farms and moving between farms. We have, because of the coronavirus, children at home when they normally maybe wouldn't be, and a huge amount of activity going on. So I suppose that HSA message and from us in the journal as well would be just to stop, slow down, think and plan so that you can avoid any possible risk and make changes where you have to avoid that potential farm accident.
You're dead right, yeah. And I mean, look, we've touched off it a couple of times, as I said. So, I mean, again, with that, and, at the risk of repeating ourselves, but I mean, I think it's very worthy. We put a call into Ciarán Roche, who's head of, I suppose, risk with FBD Insurance, again, just to get his thoughts on where the situation is at farm level.
Yeah, sadly, Jack, there has been 7 fatalities on Irish farms to date. We've had 3 child fatalities, which is very unusual and a huge concern to us, and probably linked to a lot more children being at home on the farm at the moment. We've had 3 fatalities of farmers over the age of 65, so the older profile of farmer. So 2 vulnerable groups, and it's an area that we really need to concentrate on in relation to farm safety.
I mean, the other issue that's coming up is that there's a lot of livestock. There's a lot of breeding going on farms, Ciarán, and there's bulls in a lot of fields. And I suppose they might be busy now, but in a week or 2 time, maybe there mightn't be as much activity in the fields, and they'll start getting cross, etc., and that kind of thing. It's another huge area on farms to be kind of for people to be aware of.
Yeah, I think in relation to a bull, every bull is dangerous and they should be treated in that manner. We often hear people talking about, geez, he was a quiet bull that got me. But in their nature, every bull can be very, very dangerous. Always have a safe place of refuge if you're in a field with a bull or a pen, so you can get out safely. It could be a good idea to be in the field going around in a Jeep or in your tractor so you can get out there safely. And I think that's the key thing to have. Again, a bull in the field should have a nose ring and have a chain in place.
Good tips, yeah. I suppose the other piece, and again, it just struck me when I was driving in here the other day. I mean, the sun, it's super weather, so the sun, especially in the evening times, on some roads, it can be very dangerous. In terms of you practically lose vision as you're driving along. And I suppose I'm thinking of silage trailers beginning to move now with a lot of activity in the fields in terms of cutting silage. I mean, it's a big risk area, sun, and I suppose maybe more users on roads. It's fair to say.
Yeah, the Farm Safety Partnership, we met last Friday, and two of the big issues that came up was child safety and tractor and machinery safety around silage time, and particularly in relation to machines on the road. There's a lot more people walking, running, exercising, cycling on the roads, and if you're in a big machine coming around a narrow country road and there's someone on that road that you're not expecting to, or there's more traffic than you would normally expect in a normal year, you may not be taking due care. So make sure you slow down, drive carefully, expect to have people coming around that bad bend, because people are out on the local roads getting their little bit of exercise, whether it be a child on a bike or an elderly person, or all of us are out at the moment. So we need to remind everyone who's driving a large machine on the road at this time to take extra care. Expect to see someone coming around that corner, whether it's a child, an elderly person, someone walking, running or exercising in some fashion. They're on the road. It's not a normal year. Take extra care and drive slowly.
Okay, sobering messages there from Ciarán Roche in terms of farm safety, but I think very worthwhile, and very worthwhile for everyone to listen to them carefully and see what they can do on their farm. So folks, we've come again to the end of a very busy show. I'd like to thank our guests that joined me today in terms of the panel discussion, Katrina Morrissey and Phelim O'Neill. And again, I'd also like to thank those that joined us as guests, Padraig Brennan from Bord Bia, Colin Kelly from Ornua, and Ciarán Roche from FBD. Don't forget, if for anyone interested in what's happening in the fields, we talk about turning lambs pink in Tullamore. We talk about fertility problems in dairy cows and suckler cows. So that's the Livestock Show on Friday nights on Farm Tech Talk. So folks, with that, it's stay safe and safe farming, and we'll see you next week.